Despite all his rage, he's still just Nicolas Cage. Despite all his rage, he's still just Nicolas Cage. And someone will say his career can never be saved. Despite all his rage, he's still just Nicolas Cage.
Welcome to Just Nicolas Cage, where I very slowly work my way through Nicolas Cage's filmography. And today I'm talking about the 2007 sci-fi action thriller Next. In Next, Nick Cage plays a Vegas magician with the ability to see 2 minutes ahead into his immediate future. Meanwhile, a group of terrorists have stolen a nuclear weapon, so the FBI try to pursue Nick Cage in order to get him to use its powers to uncover the location of the bomb. But Nick Cage declines due to a childhood of government-induced examinations, so the FBI then attempt to capture him, and now the chase is on. I've got a pop quiz for you hotshots. What do the movies Next, The Adjustment Bureau, Paycheck, Minority Report, A Scanner Darkly, Blade Runner, and Total Recall all have in common? That's right, the correct answer is that they all have the letter E in their title. Good job. But another thing they all have in common is that they're all adaptations of the works of esteemed sci-fi writer Philip K. Dick. The movie we're talking about today is an adaptation of the Philip K. Dick short story The Golden Man. The Golden Man is set in a dystopian post-war world where mutants called Deves are imprisoned and killed by government agents. The story follows the pursuit of a particular Deve, the titular Golden Man, and he's literally completely gold, including his hair, skin, eyes, and nails. He's described as being a beautiful golden god. He's essentially what Dennis from Always Sunny thinks he is.
The Golden God is not taking questions. I am the Golden God.
I'm picturing Dr. Manhattan, but gold instead of blue and with hair. This artist, I guess, had a different idea and just thought, let's make him Clint Eastwood, and forgot to even change the hair color. The Golden Man character in the book doesn't speak at all, but he has the power to pre-think, as they call it, which means that he can see all potential possibilities of his immediate future. He gets imprisoned by government agents and he's sentenced for execution, but he ends up seducing a female government top-level coordinator, because as we're told, he's canonically sexually irresistible to human females, and she helps him escape. And it ends with government agents lamenting that now he's gonna reproduce, and that soon his kind will be the dominant species in society. And that's the story of the Golden Man. I think it's a decent little story. I've not read much of Philip K. Dick's other work, but I think it seems quite in line with some of the concepts found in some of the other adaptations of his work that I've seen. I think there's a bit of Blade Runner in there with the advanced deviants being hunted, and it also reminded me of an episode of an anthology show I watched once called Electric Dreams. Every episode of that show was a different adaptation of a Philip K. Dick story, and the episode that the Golden Man reminded me of was Hoodmaker, which was based on a short story of the same name, and it involved people with telepathic powers being oppressed. Reading The Golden Man, I do understand why Philip K. Dick is considered one of the most important sci-fi writers of all time. He gets a lot done in these 50 or so pages. There's some really interesting concepts in here, like the idea that the peak of evolutionary progress has almost gone back to the ways of the animals, because you've got somebody who relies on instinct and can't talk, but he's also better than humankind in most ways. That's pretty interesting. The writing itself is also very good. There's some beautiful bits of prose illustrating how the Golden Man sees the different possibilities. The myriad of tableaux that surrounded him were an elaborate maze, a web which he considered bit by bit. He was looking into a doll's house of infinite rooms. I also really like the world building in the book. You hear little tidbits throughout about the other mutants, and I instantly wanted to know more. Like they mention a guy with bat wings and feathers instead of skin, and there's a guy with 2 heads and insect hybrids, and even a woman with 8 breasts. And that of course made me think of a famous scene in the Philip K. Dick adaptation Total Recall. You know, where the woman has 3 boobs? So obviously I thought, okay, that's on brand for Philip K. Dick. But then I did a quick skim through the book that Total Recall was based on, and I couldn't find anything about a woman with 3 breasts. So now I'm wondering if the scene in Total Recall with the woman with the 3 boobs is an Easter egg about the scene with the woman with the 8 boobs in Golden Man. I don't know. Please enlighten me if you know anything about Philip K. Dick's lore of bountifully breasted babes. And unfortunately, we don't even really get to encounter the woman with the 8 boobs in the short story. We just hear a brief description about her. But instead, we do hear all about the heaving bosom of a 16-year-old girl. Come on, Philip K. Dick, keep it in your pants. And on the topic of iffy stuff in the book, I personally could have done without that part I mentioned at the end of the story where it's like, by the way, the Golden Man is also an expert at seducing women. There's so many cool, interesting ways they could have had him escape the facility, but they went with him kissing a government official, and she instantly wants to elope to her winter home in Argentina with him. I just thought it was a bit of a lazy, misogynistic ending to an otherwise quite compelling story. But the thing I found probably the most interesting about the novella, and this applies to a lot of science fiction, is that it gives you an insight into the fears and concerns at the time it was written. Like, the original Twilight Zone has a lot of overtones of Cold War and communist paranoia. And I think if people in 20 years' time look back at the most popular sci-fi anthology of today, Black Mirror, people will be like, man, people were scared shitless of their phones and AI. And with The Golden Man, I'm getting a real post-World War II fear vibe from it. It was published in 1953, 8 years after the end of World War II, and I think the lingering effects of the war still hadn't left Philip K. Dick. There's multiple references to an unspecified war in the book, and there's mentions of bomb shelters still around. The story is about deviants being rounded up and imprisoned and killed, and obviously in real life the Nazis targeted people that they deemed social deviants. And also the story involves families harboring and hiding these deviants from the fascist regime, and the connotations of that are pretty obvious. And also I think that the advanced golden god at the center of the story fits into the idea of the Übermensch, which was the idea coined by the philosopher Nietzsche in 1883 that meant the next step in the evolution of man. And during the Holocaust, the term Übermensch was frequently used by Hitler to describe his idea of the master race. I also found this quote from Philip K. Dick about the story of the Golden Man. Here I'm saying that mutants are dangerous to us ordinaries. We were supposed to view them as our leaders. Maybe they wouldn't want to lead us. Maybe from their super evolved lofty level we wouldn't seem worth leading. Even if they agreed to lead us, I feel uneasy as to where we would wind up going. It might have something to do with buildings marked showers, but which really weren't. It's interesting that in that scenario he posits the mutants as the Nazis, when to me in his book there's a way more obvious line to be connected between the government in his world and the Nazis, which I guess adds to the whole moral ambiguity of it all. And at the very least that quote proves that he had Nazis on the brain when he wrote the story. Okay, so did you take note of all of that? The Golden Man who doesn't speak, and the woman with the 8 boobs, and the Übermensch, and the Nazi allegory? Good, because none of that can be found whatsoever in the Nicolas Cage movie I'm talking about today. It's set in present day, and the only person with powers is Nicolas Cage's character. His powers are kind of different and mostly more limited than the guy from the book. His motivation is completely changed, and Nick Cage isn't a beautiful golden god. Well, he's not golden anyway. I guess one change that I do like is that he can speak. I mean, what kind of movie would have Nick Cage as a silent protagonist? The only real similarities between the movie and the book are that they're both about a guy called Chris Johnson who has precognitive powers, and in both stories those characters are pursued by government agents. But even then, the motive and the morality of the agents are completely changed. So the movie Next was written by a guy called Gary Goldman, who also wrote the screenplay to 2 other Philip K. Dick adaptations, Total Recall and Minority Report. I don't know how faithful those movies are to the Philip K. Dick books, but the movies are pretty good. So I'm guessing there was some meddling going on with the executives involved with Next. According to Wikipedia, and I couldn't find a citation for this, so I don't know how true it is, but apparently there were several versions of the script written, one of which was changed on the behest of the production company to eliminate almost all of the anti-authoritarian themes, which seems to confirm my suspicions of meddling from the higher-ups. I actually found a clip of one of the producers of Next talking about the adaptation process.
What Gary Goldman, the screenwriter, did was he essentially distilled the key element of the short story and applied it to action movie context.
So in other words, he took out all the pesky things he didn't need, like subtext and world building, and just turned it into an action movie. There's really no deeper themes to be gleaned in the movie Next. At one point it does very briefly touch upon a discussion of free will versus determinism, but it's not explored at all. But let me pump the brakes a little bit. I think I've left my Philip K. Dick glasses on for a bit too long, and I'm coming at the movie from the wrong angle. We're talking about a movie where Nick Cage plays a magician that goes by the name Frank Cadillac. This movie's clearly not trying to be a multi-layered, thought-provoking, allegorical story. Like the producer said, it's an action movie, so it deserves to be evaluated as such. So how successful is it at being an action movie? I will say that the set pieces involving the powers are by far the most interesting thing about the movie. In the movie, his powers are less about seeing all possible outcomes at once, and more that he gets a 2-minute glance ahead into his immediate future. It's closer to your classic Dead Zone, That's So Raven, Madam Web type scenario. And the movie does have some fun with that. I did like when the scene would show him die horrifically, and then it would cut back to the present and you'd watch him circumvent that outcome. I also like that the movie opens with him using his powers to win at gambling in a casino, because as soon as I heard the premise of a guy who could see 2 minutes into the future, I thought if I could do that I would go to Vegas and play roulette, right? You'd see in the premonition that 22 red or whatever wins. Then you put all your money on that and rinse and repeat. But in the movie he only plays for small amounts because he wants to go unnoticed, which I suppose makes sense. There's also a decent sequence at the start where he's got all these guys coming after him, and he's easily able able to avoid them because he knows which way they'll look. Like he knows that an old man will leave his hat down briefly in the toilet that he can use to disguise himself. I enjoy stuff like that. And during the climax they utilize the power quite decently, with Cage perfectly knowing the location of the traps and the hidden gunmen. But I do think having a main character that has the power to avoid all foreseeable danger kinda lowers the stakes a little bit when you think about it. Like imagine if John McClane was magically able to know that the bad guys were gonna shoot out the glass. It would make it way less exciting. And there's also some pretty underwhelming parts involving Nicolas Cage's power in the movie. Like when he sees that he's gonna get shot by a sniper and he dodges the bullet. Which to be fair is one of the very few moments that mirrors anything from the book, because the Golden Man was able to expertly move out of the way of laser beam projectiles, but the way they show him dodge the bullet in the movie is really lame. Nick Cage very awkwardly does what looks like a hair flip to dodge the bullet. It's probably not as cool as they intended. And also the crosshair of the gun clearly shows that the bullet was gonna miss anyway. There's also this part where Cage is about to be detained by armed guards. It's like, okay, what chess level move is he gonna do now? And here's what he does.
Look at this. Look. Ta-da!
Saying ta-da after doing a cheap sleight of hand trick was apparently enough to distract this trained guard. Maybe in Nicolas Cage's vision it showed him doing I got your nose and that didn't work, so he thought, okay, what's one step up? There's another goofy part that was probably intended to look cooler than the way it was executed, where Cage overly dramatically does this hero pose to duck under a car. And there's also this silly part where he saves Julianne Moore from some badly CGI'd logs. And actually there's quite a few other instances of bad CGI in the movie. But there's other times in the movie where his power is more akin to the ability from the book, where Nick Cage is able to see different outcomes. I think that it only happens when Jessica Biel's character is involved because she amplifies his powers. But the culmination of that aspect of his power is probably the best part of the movie, where Cage needs to look for Jessica Biel in this giant facility, and to visually represent him considering all the outcomes, it shows him splitting up into multiple Nick Cages, then shows how all the different choices play out simultaneously, which is a really cool way to visually show him exploring all the different possibilities at once. And also, what better than one Nicolas Cage in your movie? A whole bunch of them. They also show him avoiding a bullet in this visual style, and it's a hell of a lot cooler than that goofy hair flip from before. But despite some of those cool moments, I still don't think they made the most of his powers in the movie. Because there's so many fun Rube Goldbergian things that you could do if you had the knowledge of future outcomes. I wanted to see some real chess move type stuff, and I didn't really get that. And instead we did get what's one of my least favorite tropes in science fiction, in the scene where Cage uses his powers of foresight to perfectly flirt with Jessica Biel. We see him look into a future where he strikes out with her, and then he amends that in the current timeline. We've seen this in loads of time travel movies like Groundhog Day and About Time. I've always had an issue with this being presented as a fine thing to do. I mean, in Groundhog Day it happens in the part of the movie where Bill Murray is still an asshole, but I just don't think you should be allowed to use time loop powers and reload save states to get a perfect run while talking to a woman. It feels gross because I think social interaction should be about the organic little awkward imperfections that go wrong. But when you rewind the mistakes until everything's perfect, then you're kind of manipulating the woman into falling in love with you. The Jordan Peele Twilight Zone reboot had a pretty great episode that explored this. In that episode, we see a time loop scenario from the point of view of a woman that's being seduced by a guy who's been through multiple time loops, and he knows all the perfect things to say to her. And the episode does a really good job at showing how creepy that behavior would be. So it's hard for me to have seen something that deconstructed that trope so well, and then watch something play it straight like in Next. So let's talk about the cast and characters, starting with Nicolas Cage. You know, I don't usually talk about Nicolas Cage's hair, but his hair or toupee or whatever is going on is pretty wild here. And I guess I now know where this meme came from, but less wild is Nicolas Cage's performance. He's very low-key here. Even in the scenes where he's a Vegas magician, Cage is only performing at about 50% of his usual energy level, which is a bit disappointing. He's not bad in the role, he is charming when he needs to be, but I think this one could have called for a bigger performance. It's just a fairly unremarkable turnout from Cage. There are some Nick Cagey elements to his character though. His introduction into the movie has an Elvis song in the background, which we know he loves, and while working as a magician, his stage name is Frank Cadillac, because he liked Frankenstein and Cadillacs, which feels pretty Nick Cage influenced. And there's some really random bits of dialogue that I suspect might have been added in by Nick Cage. There's a really weird part where he talks about a time when it rained fish in Denmark, and it has nothing to do with anything, and I can only assume that Cage just wanted to have a line about raining fish. And here's this part where he tells that old joke about the Buddhist and the hot dog.
Hey, did you hear the joke about the Zen master who ordered the hot dog?
No.
He said he'd have one with everything.
I have no idea why that was in the movie. The scene just awkwardly ends right after, and Jessica Biel doesn't seem particularly amused by it. Although, to be fair, neither was the Dalai Lama when he was told that joke.
Can you make me one with everything?
What's that? That's what it.
Also, what doesn't help is that Nick Cage screwed up the punchline. It's meant to be the guy says, make me one with everything. Not he wants one with everything. That doesn't make sense. And there's really not much to his character in this movie. That's probably why I'm talking about all this nonsense. At one point we learned that he was subjected to examination and observed play therapy since the age of 3. And the impact of that could have been interesting to show if they explored the lasting trauma of it. But they don't really dive into it other than it being a plot explanation for why he doesn't want to work with the FBI. And the only other real facet of his character is that he's in love with Jessica Biel's character, so let's talk about her. So they establish at the start of the movie that the only time when Nicolas Cage can see more than 2 minutes ahead was a premonition of him in a diner with a mysterious woman at some time in the future. So he always goes there at exactly 8:09 twice a day and has a martini. I guess he tells the bartender to hold the jelly beans this time. And then at one point in the movie he's at the diner and sees the woman for real. And the woman is Jessica Biel, and through the meet cute redo thing I described earlier, they end up forming a relationship. But their relationship in the movie is really half-baked and rushed. We don't know much about Jessica Biel's character at all. She teaches at a reservation, I guess, to make her more likable to the audience, and that's pretty much all we know. Her and Cage don't have much chemistry at all, and his interest in her is based mainly on a premonition he had, and her interest in him was formed on Nicolas Cage manipulating the fabric of time, which I don't think quite makes for a classic love story. Jessica Biel is just there to be beautiful and the damsel in distress at the end, which is quite disappointing. Also, Julianne Moore plays quite a big part in this movie, playing a hard-ass, no-nonsense FBI lady. But I don't know if Julianne Moore fully pulls it off, and her delivery is kind of stilted and cringy at times.
Somebody wants information. Now, the next time anything happens relative to Johnson, I want to know right away. I don't care if it's a paper cut.
Okay, boss.
I think her character was possibly meant to represent some of the morality play stuff from the book, because at one point she hooks Nick Cage up to a torture-like device to get him to find the location of the stolen nuclear weapons. And that could have been interesting if they delved into the whole theme of at what point does the end justify the means. Like I said earlier, according to Wikipedia, the original version of the script apparently had a much more anti-authoritarian theme, which presumably took this kind of stuff further. But in the movie we did get, it's just such a small, underdeveloped part of the film that it just felt too rushed for me to want to engage in. And ultimately, I think the movie just kind of wants us to side with Julianne Moore instead of having it be more morally grey. And on the topic of the nuclear weapons side of the story, all of the terrorist stuff is pretty cliche and uninteresting with these lame generic villains. I feel like I need a thesaurus because I'm running out of synonyms for underdeveloped, but that's the best way I can describe it. They're underdeveloped. It might have been fun if the villain also had precognition powers. You can have a cool showdown at the end where they're both thinking like, if I do this, then he'll do this, but I can do this, but he'll do this. You know, kind of like that Holmes versus Moriarty scene in the Robert Downey Jr. movie. But no, they're just people with a bomb that we know nothing about. And a big stretch of the climax of this movie is just the FBI versus generic terrorists shooting at each other. Like, if I just showed you this clip, you'd never know that it was from a sci-fi movie about a guy with psychic powers. Also, I need to talk about the ending of this movie because I have a lot to say about it. So if you don't want to be spoiled, then look ahead into the future by skipping forward a minute. Okay, so at the end of the movie, Nicolas Cage realizes that he made a mistake while trying to locate the bomb. And then the bomb blows up in a massive explosion. And then it cuts and Nick Cage wakes up in bed with Jessica Biel from earlier in the movie. And he realizes that the FBI capturing him and him working with them to take down the terrorists and the bomb exploding, all of that was just a long premonition. Then Nick Cage sets off to work with the FBI using what he knows now to help them find the bomb for real this time. So basically everything after the 45-minute mark was just a glimpse into an alternate timeline. That is a deeply unsatisfying way to end your movie. I mean, maybe that would have been an okay way to end the first episode of a TV show. You'd go, oh, cool cliffhanger, and then you put on episode 2 and you see him do the perfect run and prevent the bomb. But there was no sequel to this movie, so the audience just has to imagine what that would look like. Yeah, the ending just really annoyed me. So overall, I did not particularly care for this movie. I'm tempted to say that, oh, I wish I had the power of precognition to prevent myself from watching the movie, but it's not that bad. There's some fun to be had when the movie utilizes the central psychic power, but the characters in the story are pretty uninteresting. And it doesn't even begin to tap into the potential of the premise or Philip K. Dick's original concepts. And on top of that, the ending is garbage to the point where I can't fathom why anybody thought it'd be a good idea to end it that way. I guess it's kind of ironic that a movie about seeing into the future had such a lack of vision. I don't really recommend this movie, even for Nick Cage aficionados. Maybe if you're really into your sci-fi timey-wimey stories and there's nothing else on Netflix, then maybe. But otherwise, I don't think it's worth seeking it out. So in the immortal words of Ariana Grande, thank you, next. Next up is National Treasure Book of Secrets. So until then, guys, thanks for watching.